2 seconds. That's all the distance Quinn Beckett had left, before 154 pounds of black Neapolitan Mastiff closed the gap between them on a sunlit street in Ashford Bay. The Waitress wasn't built for running 26 years old, thin from skipped meals and double shifts, her cheap sneakers slapping the pavement as her lungs burned. Behind her, Bruno's growl rolled low like distant thunder, and she didn't dare look back. But the man who'd given the order wasn't running at all. Lucas Hale stood in the doorway of the Velvet Mire, the nightclub he owned, the empire he owned, hands buried in the pockets of a suit that cost more than Quinn earned in a year. 37. Silver creeping into dark hair, a face carved out of winter. They called him the Undertaker, in rooms where men whispered, and they were right to whisper. He'd loosed his dog on a girl who'd dared to call him a monster behind his back, and now he watched her flee like it was theater, like her terror was something he'd paid for. He was smiling, and then he wasn't, because as Quinn stumbled, something tore loose from the collar of her shirt and spun into the daylight a small silver pendant, a folded paper crane, catching the sun as it hit the concrete. Lucas Hale stopped breathing. He'd seen that crane before, years ago, bleeding out on a hospital stoop with a bullet in his side and no one left who'd claim him. A nurse with kind eyes had pressed that exact charm into his hand and told him to hold on. She'd saved a life that no one thought was worth saving, and the girl running from his dog right now had her face. For the first time in 6 years since they put his wife and daughter in the ground, and 12 years since that fateful night on the hospital stoop, Lucas Hale moved. He shouted one word, sharp as a gunshot. "Bruno, Oz." The Mastiff locked up mid-stride, paws skidding across the pavement, stopping inches from a girl curled into herself on the ground, shaking, certain she was about to die. And the most feared man in Ashford Bay was already running toward her, toward the daughter of the woman who'd once dragged him back from death, running because for the first time in a very long time, he had something to lose. What he didn't know yet was that the dying boy in a hospital across town, the boy that Pendant was for, would change everything. And the cold thing that lived where his heart used to be was about to be cracked open by a woman who had every reason to hate him. Before we go any further, do me a favor, hit that like button if you believe people can change. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to where it all began. 24 hours before everything shattered on that sun-drenched street, the Velvet Mire was still another world. A world of honey, gold light, and low music flowing like smoke. Quinn Beckett stood behind the bar close to midnight, her hands long accustomed to every motion of wiping glasses, pouring liquor, sliding drinks toward customers who never looked at her face. They saw only the black uniform, only a serving shadow whose purpose was to disappear the moment she was no longer needed. She had worked here for 8 months, long enough to know by heart the way this place swallowed people whole, long enough to understand that the most generous tips always came with looks that made her want to scrub herself clean at once. Her feet ached dully inside the cheap sneakers whose soles had worn thin, the consequence of 2 shifts stacked on top of each other, an afternoon shift at the laundromat and a night shift here, dragging on until the sun was almost ready to rise. Exhaustion had seeped into her bones like a kind of dampness that never dried. While her hands kept lining glasses on the rack, Quinn's mind counted over the number she was terrified to think about, $4,200. That was what she still owed to the lender Doyle, the broker, had introduced her to, a man named Reyes with a cold smile and debt reminders that grew shorter and sharper by the day. Each week, that number swelled a little more because of interest, like a wound that refused to heal. She hadn't borrowed it to spend on herself, but to pay for Wyatt's 3rd round of dialysis, her 19-year-old brother, who was lying in a hospital room a 15-minute drive away, with 2 kidneys dying a little more each day. When the clock showed just before 1 o'clock, as the bar thinned out, Quinn slipped into the storage corner behind her, where the smell of liquor and disinfectant braided together, then pulled out her phone and made a call. The bell rang 3 times before Wyatt's voice came through, hoarse and thin, yet still trying to sound cheerful in the way only younger brothers do, so their older sisters will worry less. He said today was all right, said the night nurse was kind, said she shouldn't work too late. Quinn leaned her back against the cold steel shelf, closed her eyes, listened to her brother's broken breathing over the line, and tried to keep her own voice perfectly normal. She asked whether he had eaten anything, asked how his numbers were today, asked the questions they both knew would never lead to good news. The kidney transplant waiting list was still long as a road with no end in sight, and every night that passed was another night she wasn't sure how much time she had left. Before hanging up, Wyatt said he loved her, and Quinn had to draw in a deep breath before she could answer without her voice breaking apart. When the phone screen went dark, she stood still in the storage room's shadows for a few more seconds, and her hand rose on its own to her throat, searching for the silver necklace hidden beneath her collar. Her fingertips touched the small silver paper crane, the only thing left from her mother, the woman who had folded a real paper crane for her when she was a little girl and taught her that every crane was a wish kept safe. Her mother, a nurse who had spent her whole life saving people the world believed weren't worth saving, had been gone for a long time. But whenever fear rose up and lodged itself across Quinn's throat, Quinn still touched that crane as though her mother's hand were still there, still warm. She whispered something too softly for anyone to hear, a plea sent into the empty air, then tucked the necklace back beneath her shirt, drew a breath, and stepped out into the yellow light. The bar grew crowded again, laughter and clinking glasses echoing around her, and Quinn became once more the silent black shadow pouring drinks for people who would never remember her face. She didn't know that in less than a day, that face, and the silver crane hidden beneath her collar, would change everything. That night, all she knew was that she was tired, she was in debt, and the little brother she loved more than her own life was waiting for a miracle she didn't know how to find. Close to 2 o'clock in the morning, when the last customers had finally staggered out, and the Velvet Mire was left with only the low murmur of background music and lights dimmed into a tired shade of yellow, Quinn began cleaning the bar the way she did every night. She didn't hear Frank Doyle's footsteps until he was already standing close behind her, so close she could feel his whiskey-soaked breath spilling against the back of her neck. Frank was the floor manager, a man in his 40s, with a swollen belly hidden beneath an expensive suit jacket, and a habit of treating every female employee as if she were property attached to the lease. He put one hand on Quinn's hip, the touch sliding lower than any accident could excuse, and said in a syrupy voice that she worked too hard, that a pretty girl like her shouldn't have to wear herself out like this, that he could arrange a few easier shifts for her if she knew how to make him happy. Quinn went rigid for 1 second, then spun around and knocked his hand off her body hard with her elbow. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She only looked straight into his eyes with a calmness that made the smile on Frank's face falter. She told him to keep his hands to himself, that she came here to pour drinks, not to sell anything else, and that if he touched her again, she wouldn't stay silent the way the girls before her had stayed silent. Frank's face flushed red, his wounded pride turning his voice from caressing to threatening in a single breath. He reminded her who he was, reminded her who this place belonged to, told her that one word from him to the higher-ups and she would lose her job, along with the meager tips she was clinging to in order to survive. He said the owner's name like a curse, as though the mere mention of Lucas Hale should be enough to bring her to her knees. But Quinn was too tired, too worn down, too full of nights spent watching her little brother grow thinner in a hospital bed, to know how to fear a man like Frank anymore. The words burst out of her when she should have swallowed them, her voice low, but each word sharp as broken glass. She said this place, and that owner he worshipped, was nothing more than a man who bought people the way he bought furniture, paid to own them, then threw them away once he was bored, a heartless monster hidden behind expensive suits, and a reputation that made the whole city bow its head. She said Lucas Hale might be able to buy the fear of everyone in that room, but he couldn't buy respect, because people don't respect what they only fear. The moment the words left her mouth, Quinn knew she had gone too far. But she didn't take them back, didn't lower her head, only tightened her grip around the cleaning towel in her hand, and stood with her back straight. In that moment, she didn't realize what Frank had realized, that behind her, in the shadowed corner near the exit to the VIP area, a figure was standing silently in the dark, and that not every sentence spoken inside the Velvet Mire vanished into the music. Frank didn't answer right away. A slow, poisonous smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, the smile of a man who had just picked up a card he knew he could play beautifully. He stepped back, adjusted his collar, then said softly that she had just made a mistake she was going to regret, that some words shouldn't be spoken in the monster's own house. Quinn didn't understand the full weight of that sentence. She only thought he was threatening her the way every rejected man threatened when his pride had been bruised. She turned away and went on lining up the glasses, leaving anger and fear to fight inside her chest, and her hand rose on its own again to her throat, searching for the silver crane hidden beneath her shirt. She didn't know that Frank had printed every word she had just said into his memory, not so he could forget them, but so he could carry them to the only person capable of turning those words into a sentence. That night, Quinn went home with her legs nearly giving out beneath her and a vague sense that something had shifted, that a spark had caught, though she couldn't yet know what it would burn down. The top floor of the Velvet Mire was a world very few people were allowed to enter. A row of sealed rooms with dark wood-paneled walls, bulletproof glass overlooking the docks of Ashford Bay, and the expensive silence of real power. Lucas Hale sat behind a walnut desk, an untouched glass of liquor beside him, his eyes fixed on a financial report on the screen that he wasn't truly reading. For 6 years, he had lived like that, working late into the night not because it was necessary, but because the empty penthouse above was more frightening than any column of numbers. Theodore Voss, the man everyone called Teddy, stood by the window with the posture of someone who was used to standing beside his boss without needing to be invited to sit. Teddy was 34 years old, neat, quiet, Lucas's right hand for 7 years, the only person besides the dog whom Lucas trusted almost completely. Something tonight seemed to make Teddy restless. He kept checking his phone, then turning it face down again, his finger tapping lightly against the window frame in a rhythm he didn't even realize. And when Lucas looked up and asked what was wrong, Teddy only shook his head and said it was nothing, an answer that came too quickly. Lucas didn't press further, but he remembered it, because a man who survived long in his world was a man who never truly let anything pass. The door opened, and Renata Hale walked in without knocking, the privilege of the woman who had raised Lucas from the time he was an unwanted street child. 60 years old, straight-backed, her silver hair neatly pinned in a bun. She was the only voice Lucas still listened to. She set a cup of tea down in front of him and reminded him, in a voice gentle but impossible to argue with, of the principle the Hale family had kept for 3 generations, that real power lay in knowing restraint, that one could be ruthless with equals but must never touch those weaker than oneself, because that was the line between a boss and a beast. Lucas listened and nodded as if to let it pass, but his eyes remained as cold as winter water. After Renata left, Frank Doyle was summoned upstairs. He came in with a manner that was half cringing and half poorly hidden satisfaction, then began pouring his story into Lucas's ear, a version bent so far out of shape it was no longer recognizable. According to Frank, the bar server named Quinn Beckett had stood in the middle of the floor, in front of the customers, openly called Lucas a monster, spat on the Hale name as if spitting on a piece of trash, and stirred up the other employees to look down on their boss. Frank didn't mention the hand he had put on her body, didn't mention his threat to have her fired, only deepened the insult, only embroidered the story until it became a public humiliation that demanded an answer. Lucas listened without changing expression, his finger slowly turning the silver ring on his right hand. He didn't care about a server girl, not in the slightest. People like that were only passing shadows to him, coming and going like loose change. But reputation was different. In his world, reputation was the weapon that kept blood from being spilled, the reason people paid their debts on time and no one dared to betray him. A monster called a monster to his face, if left unanswered, would soon be seen as a monster whose fangs had grown old. He rose, walked to the glass wall, and looked down at the street, where the lamps cast a cold light upward. Teddy looked at him, and for the first time that night, there was a flicker of hesitation on his right-hand man's face, almost like words wanting to be spoken, and then swallowed back down. Lucas made his decision not in anger, but through cold calculation, which was more terrifying than rage. He wouldn't lay a finger on that girl. He didn't need to. Tomorrow, when she finished her shift and stepped out onto the main street beneath the sunlight, he would teach her, and everyone watching, a lesson about naming the monster inside its own den. He thought of Bruno, the black Neapolitan Mastiff weighing 154 pounds, lying still in the darkness at the foot of the stairs, the only loyal creature left in his world, and a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes appeared on that face carved from winter. And so, on the following day under the blazing sun of Ashford Bay, the calculated horror unfolded exactly as Lucas had planned, leaving Quinn curled up on the hot concrete as Bruno's heavy panting filled the sudden silence. Lucas Hale crossed that distance with steps he hadn't even had time to command himself to take, and when he knelt down to pick up the silver crane still turning faintly on the pavement, the hand that never trembled suddenly went rigid. He turned the crane over in his palm, his thumb tracing the delicate folds of it, and found the tiny clasp hidden in the wing. He opened it. Inside was a photograph faded by the years, no larger than a fingernail, and a piece of paper folded into quarters, so thin it almost seemed to dissolve beneath his fingertips. Lucas didn't open that piece of paper. He couldn't, because the face in the photograph had made his heart strike one uneven beat, a beat it hadn't made in 6 years. It was the face of a woman he thought he had buried along with the part of his life he never told anyone about, a woman with eyes so gentle that even memory couldn't dim them. For one instant, Lucas was no longer the boss standing in the middle of Ashford Bay. He was a young man bleeding heavily on the hospital steps, the one the whole world had turned its back on, and the one those hands had pulled back from the edge of death. He lifted his eyes to the girl trembling on the ground, and for the first time, he truly looked at her, not as a serving shadow, not as a lesson that needed to be taught, but as a question he hadn't yet dared to name. Her face, even twisted by fear and tears, carried something of the woman in the photograph, a resemblance that sent a chill across the back of his neck. Quinn didn't see what was happening inside that man. She saw only the shadow of the one who had released the monster toward her falling over her body. She saw only his hand reaching out, and in her panic she was certain this was the final moment of her life, that this man would finish what the dog hadn't had time to do. She shrank in on herself, both hands over her head, her mouth stammering as she begged him not to, begged him to let her go back to her brother, her voice breaking into pieces that no longer had any shape. But Lucas's hand didn't tighten. It touched her shoulder, strangely gentle. And when his voice rose, it didn't carry the coldness she had been waiting for, only a low, hoarse command telling her to stand, telling her she was safe now. Teddy stood a few steps away, and in 7 years of following Lucas, this was the first time he had ever seen that winter-carved face crack open, the first time he had seen something living flare in his boss's empty eyes, so fiercely it was almost frightening. Teddy had seen Lucas order men killed without blinking, had seen him stand still in the middle of blood without changing color, but he had never seen him kneel for anyone, had never seen his hand tremble. Lucas rose, one hand still gripping the silver crane as though he feared it might vanish, the other supporting Quinn by the elbow and lifting her up. He turned to Teddy and ordered him to take her inside, call the private doctor, let no one touch her, his voice so sharp that Teddy understood this wasn't a request but a line between life and death. Quinn staggered, her mind spinning between fear and confusion, unable to reconcile the image of the monster who had just set a dog on her with the man now carefully keeping her from falling. She didn't know that in his clenched hand were a crane, a photograph, and an unopened piece of paper. 3 small things that had just brought down an entire wall Lucas Hale had spent 6 years building so no one, not even he himself, could touch the place where his heart had once beaten. That night, after the private doctor had bandaged the scratches on Quinn's arm, and she had been taken home in a car she couldn't understand why anyone would send for her, Lucas Hale sat alone in his office, with the silver crane placed before him, and a stack of files Teddy had been ordered to gather within a few hours. Money could buy many things in Ashford Bay, and information was the cheapest of them all. He read line after line beneath the yellow glow of the desk lamp, and the picture of the life belonging to the girl he had nearly destroyed today slowly appeared before him, clear and merciless. Quinn Beckett, 26 years old, orphaned of both father and mother, worked 2 shifts every day to pay for a damp apartment in South Bristol, a rundown district of Ashford Bay, and to support her only younger brother. Wyatt Beckett, 19 years old, end-stage kidney failure, was on dialysis 3 times a week, his name suspended halfway down an organ transplant waiting list so long it felt hopeless. Her financial records were a chain of red numbers, a $4,200 loan from a loan shark named Reyes, and hospital bills piled so high that she paid them in tiny trickles, like trying to build a levee with bare hands before a flood. Lucas set the paper down, and in the silence of the room, the memory he had kept locked away for 12 years began to seep through the cracks. That year, he had been 25 years old, still only a low-ranking soldier in a world that didn't yet belong to him, and a deal gone wrong had left a bullet in his hip. The men he called his brothers had abandoned him on the back steps of a public hospital, the way people threw away a sack of garbage, leaving him to bleed in the cold night with the certainty that he was going to die, and that no one in this world would grieve over it. He remembered the cold soaking into his back. He remembered the sound of car horns fading into the distance. He remembered the moment he stopped trying. Then a hand touched him, a nurse coming off a late shift, a woman who should have simply stepped past him like everyone else, knelt beside the body the whole world believed wasn't worth saving. She didn't ask who he was, didn't ask why he had a bullet inside him, didn't call the police so she could wash her hands of him. She only pressed down hard on the wound with her own coat, speaking to him in a voice so gentle he thought he had died and this was a dream, telling him to keep holding on to life, that no human life was trash. And before they carried him into the emergency room, she placed a small silver crane into his blood-soaked palm and told him it would keep him here. Lucas lived. He had gone looking for her afterward, just once, standing at a distance as he watched her standing with a thin, 14-year-old girl outside the hospital gate, and he had not stepped forward, because he knew the darkness he carried shouldn't touch that kind of light. He had never known her name, until tonight, when that same silver crane fell from the collar of a girl who carried her face. Lucas tightened his hand around the small silver object, and an emotion he had forgotten how to name rose up and lodged itself inside his chest. He told himself this wasn't kindness. He no longer knew what kindness was. He told himself that a man like him always paid his debts, that this was only a debt of grace that needed to be settled so the books could balance, nothing more and nothing less. In the middle of the night, he called the manager of his private fund and ordered him to pay every medical expense for Wyatt Beckett, move the boy's name higher on every list that money and power could reach, and wipe clean the debt owed to Reyes. Everything had to be done through an anonymous fund, with no trace leading back to him, with no word of thanks allowed to exist. He wasn't doing this to be thanked, he told himself, as he turned off the light. He was only repaying a debt to a dead woman, and that girl would never need to know that the man who had saved her brother was the monster whose true name she had spoken. 3 days later, when Quinn came to the hospital to visit Wyatt as usual, she stood frozen before the cashier's counter when the clerk told her that every one of her brother's bills had been paid, that the debt to Reyes had vanished without a trace, that Wyatt's name had been moved to a priority position on the transplant waiting list. She asked who had done it, asked again and again, but the only answer was a nameless, faceless, anonymous fund. Quinn wasn't naive. She had lived long enough in this city to know that no miracle came free, that anonymous kindness in Ashford Bay was often a velvet-wrapped noose, and there was only one person who had just stepped into her life with enough power to erase all those numbers with a single phone call. She took a car to the Velvet Mire in the middle of the day, when the place was still closed and empty, knocked on the door until Teddy opened it, and demanded to see Lucas Hale. Perhaps it was the stubbornness in her voice. Perhaps it was something Teddy had seen in his boss's eyes that night. But the door to the top floor was opened. Lucas sat behind the walnut desk, showing no surprise, as though he had been waiting for this moment. Quinn didn't sit in the chair he glanced toward. She stood straight in the middle of that expensive room, in her faded clothes, and placed a thin stack of cash on his desk. Everything she had managed to gather, along with the declaration that she would repay every remaining dollar no matter how many years it took. She said she didn't need his pity. Lucas raised an eyebrow, his voice cold and mocking, asking whether she knew what she was refusing, whether she knew how many people would get down on their knees for what he had just given her. Quinn looked straight into his eyes, and that was what made him pause, because in this room, in this entire city, no one dared look directly into Lucas Hale's winter eyes without lowering their own. She said she knew very well. She said kindness bought with the money of a man who set a dog on someone in the middle of the street wasn't kindness at all. It was just another way of owning someone, and she would rather carry debt for the rest of her life than let her brother live on the charity of a man who didn't even see her as human. She told him he might be able to buy Wyatt's life, but he couldn't buy her silence or her gratitude, because she had seen who he truly was on the day he stood there smiling while she ran for her life. Lucas stood, moved around the desk, and came closer to her, a movement that should have made anyone step back. Quinn didn't step back. She lifted her chin and went on, her voice not loud, but every word sinking deep, saying that she saw exactly who he was, a man rich enough to buy an entire city, yet poor enough not to have a single person who dared tell him the truth, a man who had built his walls so high that he had imprisoned himself inside them, and called that loneliness power. She said he surrounded himself with frightened flatterers like Frank Doyle, then wondered why every night ended with him alone. Those words touched a place no one had ever dared touch, and for one moment Lucas couldn't find an answer. The rare silence of a man who always controlled every conversation. He looked at the thin young woman standing before him, the woman who had just returned what the whole world longed for and thrown into his face, the truth no one dared speak, and something inside his chest, the part he thought had died with his wife and child, stirred with a quiet, painful motion. He didn't take back the stack of money. He only said, so softly it was almost to himself, that she knew nothing about him. Quinn picked up the money, put it back in her bag, and before she turned away, she spoke one final sentence, saying, maybe she didn't know, but at least she wasn't afraid to find out, which perhaps meant he was the one who was afraid. Then she walked out, leaving Lucas Hale standing alone in the middle of his room of power, feeling for the first time in many years that the wall he had built had begun to crack. Lucas Hale wasn't used to being refused, and he was even less used to having a refusal cling to him with such stubborn persistence. He couldn't give back the past to the woman who had saved him, but he could pull her daughter into his orbit in a way she couldn't reject, and he did it with the familiar coldness of calculation. He didn't say a word to Quinn. He only ordered Teddy to arrange for her to be moved out of the night shift at the bar, away from Frank Doyle's reach, into a position managing the liquor inventory, with 3 times the pay and decent hours, enough for her to have time beside her brother. Quinn was suspicious, of course, but she needed that job, needed every dollar for the days Wyatt was still in the hospital, and she understood that refusing honest work because of pride was a luxury poor people had no right to own. She took the job, but she kept her distance, and every time she crossed paths with Lucas in the dark wood hallways of the building, she only gave him a cold nod and continued on. Meanwhile, Reyes, the loan shark who had once strangled Quinn with threats, suddenly disappeared from South Bristol. Lucas had ordered the operation to be executed with absolute discretion, ensuring no ripples reached the rest of the underworld. No one knew exactly what had happened. They only knew that one night, several men dressed in dark clothing had knocked on his door, and by the next morning, he had left the city without even having time to take his belongings, leaving a message for his men that from then on, the Beckett name was a name no one was allowed to touch. Lucas didn't tell Quinn this, and she didn't ask, but she understood, in the way people understand things that happen in the dark, without needing anyone to confirm them. That was his power, a kind of violence without display, clean and cold, solving problems without leaving a single drop of blood on his hands. And it made her shiver even as she couldn't deny that. For the first time in many years, she slept through the night without being woken by the ringing of a debt collector's phone call. What Quinn hadn't expected was Bruno, the black Neapolitan Mastiff that had once charged toward her like a nightmare, now appeared in places she didn't expect. Lying outside the liquor store room where she worked, his deep brown eyes following every step she took with a strange patience. The first time, she went rigid, her back pressed against the liquor shelf, her heart pounding as she remembered his breath close to the back of her neck. But the animal didn't growl. He didn't lunge. He only lay there, resting his heavy head on his front paws, watching her as though he were waiting for something. It took Quinn many days before she dared push a piece of leftover meat from lunch toward him, and Bruno accepted it with a gentleness that was astonishing in a creature weighing 154 pounds, one that could have snapped human bone in his jaws. Gradually, without her even understanding when it began, the dog started following her through the empty hallways, rubbing his enormous head against her palm, and Quinn realized that beneath all that frightening muscle was a creature that had never truly wanted to be a weapon. Only a loyal animal turned into whatever his master needed him to be. Teddy was the first to remark, in a voice half joking and half serious, that in 7 years he had never seen Bruno let anyone besides Lucas touch him. And once, when Quinn was crouched beside the dog in a corner of the hallway, gently scratching behind his ear, she looked up and caught Lucas standing at the end of the corridor, motionless in the darkness, watching the scene with an expression she couldn't read. He said nothing, only turned away after a few seconds, but Quinn had enough time to see something in those winter eyes, something almost like longing, as though he too were standing outside the door of a warmth he had forgotten how to enter. The dog trusted her before his master dared to, and none of those 3 living souls said it aloud, but all of them began to feel that some kind of ice, frozen solid for 6 years, was quietly beginning to melt in the dark hallways of the Velvet Mire. One rainy afternoon, while Quinn was taking inventory of the liquor crates in the storage room, Renata Hale came to find her, carrying 2 cups of hot tea and the straight-backed bearing of a woman who had witnessed too much in her life. Quinn had glimpsed her a few times before, enough to know this was the only person in the building Lucas truly listened to, the woman who had raised him from the time he was a street child. Renata sat down on the old wooden chair, handed her a cup of tea, and said she had been watching her, had seen the way Bruno followed her, had seen the way Lucas looked at her when he thought no one was paying attention, and she thought it was time Quinn knew how the man she hated had truly become that monster. Quinn meant to say she didn't care, but there was something in the old woman's voice that made her fall silent and listen. Renata told her, slowly, that Lucas had not always been the undertaker. 6 years ago, he had been a different man. A man who was still cold in business, but knew how to smile when he came home. Because at home, there had been a wife named Adeline and a little daughter named Ivy, barely 3 years old. Renata spoke of Ivy with a trembling voice, of her curly hair, of the way she used to climb onto Lucas's lap and tug at his hand, demanding a story, of the way the most ruthless man in Ashford Bay had once knelt on the floor to play pretend tea with his daughter's dolls. Then she spoke of the night that killed that man and gave birth to the monster who took his place. A man named Victor Kane, the boss of a rival crew, a man who had long coveted the Hale family's territory, had not attacked Lucas head-on, but had chosen the most cowardly path. He had sent men to ambush the car carrying Adeline and Ivy on their way home from preschool. Lucas arrived only a few minutes later, soon enough to hold the still warm bodies of his wife and child. Too late to save anyone. Renata said she was the one who found him the next morning, sitting motionless on the hospital floor, and that from that moment on, his eyes were never warm again. He buried his wife and daughter, and with them, he buried the part of himself that still knew how to love, raising walls, turning his heart into something made of ice, and swearing he would never again allow himself to become soft enough to lose anyone else. Quinn sat listening, both hands wrapped around the cup of tea that had gone cold, and she felt something inside her chest crack open. She understood, for the first time, that Lucas's cruel coldness wasn't his original nature but a thick layer of scar tissue over a wound that had never healed, that the man who had once smiled while watching her run was also the man who had once knelt to play pretend tea with his little girl. But even as tears rose hot and stinging at the corners of her eyes, Quinn didn't allow herself to slip into easy forgiveness. She told Renata, her voice soft but steady, that she was deeply sorry for what he had lost, that no one deserved to carry such pain. But pain, no matter how great, wasn't a license to turn other people into a place to pour out rage, and it didn't give him the right to set a dog on a girl in the middle of the street just because she dared tell the truth. She said tragedy explained the person he had become, but it didn't erase his responsibility for what he did. Renata looked at her for a long while, then nodded slowly, and in the old woman's eyes there was something almost like relief, as though this was exactly the answer she had been waiting for. She said that was why she had told Quinn instead of anyone else, because the people around Lucas only knew how to fear him or flatter him, and not one of them dared both care for him and hold him accountable. She stood, placed her wrinkled hand on Quinn's shoulder, and said Victor Kane was still out there, that the old war had never truly ended, and that Quinn should be careful, because anyone who stepped into Lucas Hale's heart became something his enemies would try to use. After Renata left, Quinn remained sitting alone in the dark liquor room, her hand searching for the silver crane at her throat, and for the first time she thought of Lucas not as a monster, but as a broken man drowning in his own pain, and she was frightened to realize that she had begun to want to reach out and pull him up. After that rainy afternoon, something between Quinn and Lucas changed, a softening that both of them could feel but neither dared to name. They began to talk, at first only in brief sentences about work, then gradually longer ones on nights when the building had emptied out. Late one night, when Quinn stayed behind to check the inventory and Lucas happened to stop by, the two of them remained together in the dark wood office, an opened bottle of wine between them on the desk, Bruno lying at their feet. Lucas spoke, for the first time, of things he had never told anyone. Not about Adeline or Ivy, because he still couldn't touch those names, but about the exhaustion of being a monster, about the sleepless nights in the empty penthouse above, about the feeling of becoming a name that frightened people so much they forgot there was still a human being underneath it. Quinn listened, and she told him about her mother, about the paper cranes, about Wyatt, about the fear she carried every night that she would lose her only younger brother. In the lowered yellow light, the distance between them narrowed without either of them realizing it, until Lucas reached out and brushed a strand of hair away from her forehead, a gesture so gentle it left them both still. They were very close. Close enough for Quinn to hear the uneven rhythm of his breathing. Close enough to see those winter eyes lit for the first time with a warmth struggling to stay alive. In a moment, suspended between two hearts, they both leaned toward each other, and their lips came so near that only a breath remained between them. Then Lucas stopped. He jerked back as though he had touched fire, shot to his feet, turned his back to her, and Quinn saw his shoulders go rigid beneath his shirt. When he turned around again, the warmth in his eyes had frozen over once more, colder than it had been the first time she met him, and his voice rose with a cruelty carefully calculated to wound. He said she had misunderstood, that she was only the daughter of someone he owed, that he had helped her to settle an old debt, not because she meant anything to him, that she shouldn't confuse pity with anything else. He said those words in a flat voice, each one like a knife aimed directly at the softest place, and Quinn felt them drive into her chest. She didn't cry in front of him. She wouldn't allow herself to do that. But her face went pale, and the hurt in her eyes was something Lucas didn't dare look at for long. She stood, her voice trembling but still straight, and said he was right, that she had been foolish to think there was a human being hidden behind the monster, that she wouldn't make that mistake again. Then she walked out, leaving Bruno to lift his head and watch her go with sorrowful eyes, leaving Lucas alone in the room with the unfinished bottle of wine. He stood there for a long time after the door closed, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white, and the truth he didn't dare admit pressed heavily against his chest. He hadn't pushed her away because she meant nothing to him. He had pushed her away precisely because she had come to mean far too much. 6 years earlier, he had learned the lesson that loving someone meant placing a dagger in an enemy's hand and giving them a path to his heart, that everything he treasured could be turned into a weapon against him, that the only way not to lose anything more was never to have anything more to lose. And now, when the heart he had believed dead had begun to beat again because of a thin young woman who dared look straight into his eyes, that fear rose up and drowned him, stronger than desire. He would rather smash with his own hands the fragile thing that had only just begun to bloom than let fate tear it from him once again. He told himself he had done the right thing, that he had protected them both from an unavoidable tragedy. But when he looked down at the silver crane he still kept in his desk drawer, he knew he had just lied, and that lie tasted more bitter than anything he had ever swallowed. More than a week after the night Lucas pushed her away, while Quinn was still keeping a cold distance from him in the hallways of the building, a call from the hospital shook everything. A compatible kidney had just appeared, a rare match that was almost perfect for Wyatt. But that chance was as fragile as morning mist, because there was another patient who also qualified, and the usual review process could drag on long enough for the opportunity to slip away, long enough for Wyatt's 2 dying kidneys to give up. Quinn collapsed right there in the hospital corridor, the phone pressed to her ear, listening as the doctor explained the procedures, the committees, the lists she had no power to influence. She begged, asked whether there was any way to move things faster, and the only answer was the regret-filled silence of an overwhelmed system. In her desperation, Quinn didn't even know whose number she had dialed. She only knew that when Lucas's voice came through on the other end, she told him everything through tears, forgetting that she was angry with him, forgetting the cold wall between them, leaving only a sister pleading with anyone who might be able to save her little brother. Lucas didn't say much. He only told her to stay where she was, then hung up. What happened after that, Quinn was only able to piece together later through scattered fragments. Somehow, within just a few hours, Wyatt's transplant was moved to the highest priority. A leading surgical team was brought in, and every administrative barrier dissolved as if it had never existed. She didn't know whom Lucas had called, what he had promised or threatened in the dark. She only knew that when she ran back to the surgical waiting room, her brother had already been taken into the operation that might save his life. During the long hours of waiting outside the operating room, Quinn sat beside an older nurse who had worked at that hospital for decades. When the nurse saw the silver crane at Quinn's throat, she froze, then asked whether Quinn was Marion Beckett's daughter. Quinn nodded, surprised, and the nurse told her that she had once worked with her mother, that Marion was the kindest nurse she had ever known, a woman who always folded little silver cranes for the most hopeless patients. Then she told Quinn an old story about a night many years earlier, when Marion had saved a young man who had been shot and left on the back steps. A man everyone said they should call the police on and leave alone, but Marion had knelt down and saved him, then placed in his hand a silver crane just like the one Quinn was wearing. Quinn sat frozen as every piece fell into its proper place. The crane Lucas had picked up on the street, the way his breath had stopped when he saw it, the hospital bills that had vanished without a trace, the debt wiped clean, Wyatt's name moved to the top of every list, and now the kidney transplant appearing like a miracle. None of it had been the pity of a monster. It was a debt of grace stretching across 12 years, a man paying back the woman who had saved his life by saving the children she had left behind. When the operation ended, and the doctor came out with the news that Wyatt had passed the critical point and the kidney was working, Quinn broke down crying, but woven through those tears of relief was a new and staggering truth about the man she thought she had understood. She went to find Lucas that very night, while he was standing alone beside the glass wall, looking down over the harbor. She said nothing about the old anger, didn't mention the night he had pushed her away. She only stood before him, her tears not yet dry, and asked why he had never told her that her mother had saved him. Lucas turned back, and this time he raised no wall, because there was nowhere left to hide. He said softly that he owed her mother his whole life, that he didn't deserve Quinn's gratitude, that he had helped Wyatt not to make amends, but because it was the only right thing he still could do in an entire life filled with sin. Quinn stepped toward him, and this time, when the distance between them narrowed, neither of them moved away. She placed her hand on his chest, right over the heart he had believed was dead, and she felt it beating, fast and real, beneath her palm. In that moment, they both knew the wall had fallen, and that from this second on, Lucas Hale once again had something to lose, a truth that was both salvation and danger, and neither of them could yet imagine the price that was coming. While Lucas and Quinn were finding each other in the darkness of the building, another kind of darkness was tightening around them, without anyone knowing. Frank Doyle had never forgotten the night he was humiliated by a bar server, and he could swallow even less the fact that the girl had not only gone unpunished, but had been promoted, protected by the boss, and followed with affection by Lucas's most dangerous dog. The jealousy inside him fermented into hatred, and a man like Frank, who only knew how to kneel before the powerful, did the most cowardly thing men like him always do when they lack the courage to face someone directly. He went to his master's enemy. In a dark bar on the other side of the city, Frank sat across from a man whose name alone was enough to make all of Ashford Bay shudder. Victor Kane, the boss of the rival crew, the man who had killed Lucas's wife and child 6 years earlier, and still carried the ambition of swallowing the Hale territory whole. Frank sold everything he knew in exchange for a stack of money and the promise of a position inside Kane's organization once the Hale family fell. He told Kane about the girl named Quinn Beckett, about the way Lucas Hale, the man who had been cold as stone for 6 years, had suddenly changed because of her, about how the monster of Ashford Bay had finally grown a heart again, and a heart was a weakness. Victor Kane listened with the slow smile of a hunting beast that had just caught the scent of blood. He had waited 6 years to find the true way to destroy Lucas Hale, not by killing him, because death was too quick and too merciful, but by taking from him once more the thing he treasured, so that he would have to go on living in the hell Kane had created. Frank's information was the final piece Kane needed, but Kane was a man who never relied on only one card, and this was the second layer of the trap, the layer even Frank didn't know about. Many months earlier, Kane had quietly slipped a leash into the very heart of the Hale family's inner circle, and that leash was wrapped around the throat of Theodore Voss, Lucas's right-hand man. Teddy had a sister named Sloane, the only sibling he had left in the world, and Sloane had fallen into a crushing gambling debt with a casino secretly controlled by Victor Kane. Kane had bought that debt, and with it, he bought Teddy's soul. He gave Teddy 2 choices: either become his eyes and ears inside the Hale Empire, or watch his sister vanish without a trace. That was why, over these past weeks, Teddy had always seemed restless, always checking his phone and turning it face down, always carrying on his face a kind of tearing conflict. Lucas had briefly noticed, but hadn't yet had time to follow to the end. Teddy had betrayed the man he had served faithfully for 7 years, but he did it with his heart ripped in half. Every piece of information he passed to Kane, feeling like a knife he drove into himself. He had tried to delay, had sent the smallest and least important details he could, had told himself he was only buying time to find a way to save both Sloane and Lucas. But now, with Frank appearing and confirming exactly what Kane had suspected about Quinn, Teddy's role could no longer remain a matter of stalling. Kane summoned him, and in an ice-cold voice, ordered him to provide Quinn Beckett's schedule, the places she went, the times she was alone, every moment when she didn't have Lucas or Bruno beside her. Teddy stood there, his hand clenched around the phone in his pocket, thinking of Sloane's face, thinking of the man who had taken him in, and feeling himself being crushed between 2 people he couldn't save at the same time. Victor Kane arranged every piece into its proper place, patient and merciless, and when he looked at the photograph of Quinn Beckett that Frank had given him, he knew he had finally found the perfect dagger to drive into the newly awakened heart of his lifelong enemy. Inside the Hale family's building, Lucas and Quinn slept peacefully in each other's arms for the first time, unaware that the trap had already been laid, and that the most dangerous traitor was not the contemptible Frank, but the man standing closest to Lucas. Kane didn't need to break into the Hale family's fortress. He only needed to wait for Quinn to step out of it on her own, and he knew exactly what would pull her out. 3 days after Wyatt survived the transplant, he was moved to a recovery unit for observation, and Quinn still visited him every morning before work. A routine Teddy, with a heart heavy as lead, had been forced to report to Kane. That morning, just as Quinn left the Hale building to go to the hospital, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was cold and calm enough to make the skin crawl, introducing itself as one of Victor Kane's people. Then reading back to her details only someone on the inside could know: Wyatt's room number, the name of the nurse on duty, the color of the car she had just stepped out of. The voice told her that if she wanted her brother to keep breathing through the night, she would do exactly as instructed, wouldn't call Lucas, wouldn't warn anyone, and would go by herself to an address in the Old Harbor district within 30 minutes, alone. Any sign of police or Hale people, and an injection would end Wyatt's life right in his hospital bed before Lucas could get there. Quinn stood frozen on the sidewalk, the blood draining from her face. She knew this wasn't an empty threat, because that voice knew too much, knew things that could only have come from the inside. In that horrifying moment, every instinct in her screamed at her to call Lucas, but the image of her younger brother, who had just fought his way back to life, lying helpless in a hospital bed, bound her hands tight. She couldn't gamble with Wyatt's life. She shoved the phone into her pocket, hailed a taxi, and gave the address in the Old Harbor district in a trembling voice, her hand gripping the silver crane at her throat as though clinging to one final prayer. The Old Harbor district was a graveyard of abandoned warehouses, rusted and silent beneath a gray sky. Quinn stepped into the building she had been sent to, and the iron door slammed shut behind her with a chilling echo. Victor Kane stood there in the middle of the wide-open space, a man in his 40s with a polished appearance that hid a kind of cruelty even Lucas had reason to fear. He smiled when he saw her, a smile that never reached his dead eyes, and said she was even prettier than in the photograph, that he understood why the frozen monster had melted for her. He told her not to worry about her brother, that Wyatt would be fine as long as she remained useful, because she wasn't his target. She was only the rope meant to pull the real prey out of its den. In the dark corner behind Kane, Quinn saw a figure tied and slumped in a chair, and when her eyes adjusted to the light, she recognized Frank Doyle, his face bruised, his expensive suit torn to shreds. Kane smirked and explained, almost with pleasure, that Frank had done his part well by selling information, but a man who betrayed one master would betray another, and Victor Kane never kept a dog in his organization once it had bitten the hand that fed it. Frank lifted his head, his desperate, pleading eyes sweeping toward Quinn, stammering that he hadn't thought things would go this far, that he had only wanted her fired, not this, but that late confession no longer meant anything. Kane gave a slight nod to one of his men, and Frank was dragged away through another door, his cries dying behind the wall, a silent end mark for the man who had lit the fuse for everything. Quinn stood trembling in the cold warehouse, understanding with bone-deep horror that she had walked into the beast's jaws to save her brother, and that now Kane's entire plan depended on Lucas Hale doing exactly what his newly awakened heart would urge him to do, rushing in to save her and falling straight into the trap waiting for him. Kane pulled Quinn's phone from her hand, scrolled to Lucas's name, and with the smile of a man who had waited 6 years for this moment, he pressed call. When Lucas's phone rang and Quinn's name appeared on the screen, he answered with a fleeting smile he hadn't thought he still knew how to make only a few weeks earlier. But the voice that came through wasn't hers. It was Victor Kane's voice, a voice he had heard in nightmares for 6 years, a voice bound forever to the image of the still warm bodies of his wife and child. Kane spoke slowly, savoring every second, saying he had the girl with the silver crane, that if Lucas wanted to see her whole again, he knew where to find him, and that this time Kane truly hoped Lucas would come, unlike 6 years ago, when he had arrived too late. Then the line went dead. For one moment, Lucas Hale's entire world shrank into a single white point of rage colder than ice. He had once lost everything because he had been too late, and the thought that history was repeating itself, that Kane once again held in his hands the one thing that made Lucas's heart beat, ignited something inside him that 6 years of numbness hadn't been able to extinguish. But Lucas was no longer the young man who had raced forward in the panic of 6 years ago. He drew one breath, and that rage froze into something sharp, deliberate, and controlled. He called Renata, called the most loyal people in the family, and summoned them to his office in less than 1 hour. When they gathered around the walnut desk, Lucas stood at the head of the room, and those who had followed him for many years immediately recognized that something in their boss had changed. For 6 years, he had given orders for power, for territory, for numbers and maps of influence, cold as a machine. Tonight, for the first time, he was acting for a human being. Renata looked at him and saw the things she had thought had died with Adeline living again in his eyes, and she knew, with a fear mingled with comfort, that the son she had raised had finally come back. Lucas spread the map of the old harbor district across the desk. He knew it was a trap. He wasn't naive. Kane wanted him to come, and Lucas understood that completely, but he also knew that refusing to go meant Quinn's death, and that was a price he would never pay. So he didn't rush in like a blind man. He stepped into the trap with his eyes wide open and a plan of his own. He divided his people into several teams, arranged distant positions to surround the area, calculated the exits and the blind spots around the warehouse. While they discussed the plan, his gaze passed over Teddy, who stood at the edge of the room with a bloodless face and hands that couldn't hide their trembling. A flicker of suspicion flashed through Lucas's mind, that old instinct telling him something was wrong with his right-hand man. But time didn't allow him to follow it to the end, and he was forced to push it aside, a mistake he didn't yet know he was about to pay for. Before leaving, Lucas went downstairs, where Bruno stood waiting as though he had already sensed the coming storm. Lucas knelt before the dog, placed a hand on his enormous head, and looked into those deep brown eyes. This animal had once been used by him as a weapon, trained to sow fear, and it had been Bruno who chased Quinn down the street on that fateful day. But Bruno was also the first living creature to learn how to love her, had lain guard outside her door, had pressed his head into her palm. Tonight, Lucas needed him not as a weapon of fear, but as a weapon of loyalty, to find and protect the person both of them had chosen. He gave a quiet command, and Bruno rose, his whole body going taut, ears lifted, ready. When Lucas stepped out toward the black car waiting beneath the cold streetlights, the dog stayed close at his heel, and in the chest of the man who had once told himself he would never again have anything to lose, his heart struck one violent beat, belonging to someone who had finally found a reason to fight, and to be afraid. The black convoy rolled into the old harbor district under cover of night, lights off, moving in silence like ghosts. Lucas had positioned every team according to plan, the Hale family's best gunmen spreading out to surround the warehouse from hidden angles, and everything seemed to be within his control. But the moment the first assault team drew close to the side door, everything shattered. Kane's men weren't in the places they were supposed to be. They had already been lying in wait at the very blind spots Lucas had chosen as his approach routes, as though they had known every move he would make in advance. Gunfire tore through the dark, and 2 of Lucas's men went down before they could understand what was happening. In that chaotic instant, the truth struck Lucas like a fist to the chest. Only one person knew the entire plan down to each point of entry. He spun around to find Teddy, and caught sight of his right hand, man's bloodless face, as he stood frozen in place, the phone still glowing in his hand, and in Teddy's eyes there wasn't the fear of a man under attack, but the gut-wrenching pain of a man who had just betrayed someone. For 1 second that stretched into eternity, the 2 men looked at each other, 7 years of loyalty collapsing in silence, and Lucas understood that the instinct he had pushed aside was the very thing that had just gotten his people killed. But there was no time for rage, because inside the warehouse, Quinn was alone with Victor Kane. Inside, Quinn hadn't sat still waiting to die. All through the time she had been held, she had watched, counted the gunmen, noticed that the man guarding her kept touching the knife tucked at his hip, and setting his gun down on the wooden crate every time he lit a cigarette. When the first gunshot cracked outside, and the guard's attention snapped toward the door, Quinn didn't shrink back like prey. She snatched up a glass bottle from the nearby crate, smashed it against the iron edge, and when the nearest guard turned back, she drove the broken glass into his hand and ran toward the darkness of the stacked shelves. She wasn't strong, she wasn't trained, but she knew her fear, and she turned it into speed, slipping through narrow aisles where large men struggled to follow. Kane roared for them to catch her, and his polished calm cracked for the first time into fury. It was in that chaos that Bruno appeared. Lucas had released him inside through a gap by the side door the moment the gunfight began, and the 154-pound Neapolitan Mastiff surged through the warehouse like a living mass of darkness, following the one scent he had memorized through the past weeks, Quinn's scent. He found her just as one of Cain's men had driven her into a corner. And the animal once trained to spread fear now unleashed all that ferocity on the man, threatening the person he protected, dragging him down and giving Quinn a path to run. She called the dog's name through a sob, one hand clutching his thick fur, and for the first time since stepping into the warehouse, she was no longer alone. Bruno guided her along the wall, away from the line of fire, toward the gap he had crawled through. Outside, Lucas fought to break through Cain's defenses, with half his plan already in ruins, and loyal men falling around him, his heart torn between fury at Teddy and terror for Quinn. He saw Bruno's shape appear at the gap, saw Quinn's hair behind him, and a fierce spark of hope flared inside his chest. But at the same time, Victor Cain also saw his prey slipping out of his hands, and he raised his gun, aiming straight at the girl running toward freedom. Teddy, standing between the line of betrayal and conscience, saw Cain's barrel tracking Quinn. And in that moment, the choice he had been running from for weeks finally cornered him, leaving him nowhere else to turn. In the moment when Cain's gun barrel tracked Quinn, Teddy no longer thought of Sloane, no longer thought of the debt, no longer thought of the net Cain had tightened around his throat for so many months. He saw only the innocent girl running toward life, and the man who had taken him in when he had been nothing. And he understood that all his stalling, all the excuses he had told himself about trying to save both sides, had led to this very second. There was no clean way out anymore. There was only one right thing left for him to do, after everything he had done wrong. Teddy lunged forward. He didn't shoot Cain. He couldn't do it in time. He only threw his whole body into the path of the bullet, shoving Quinn down behind a shelf at the exact instant Victor Cain pulled the trigger. The gunshot cracked through the warehouse, dry and brutal, and Teddy jerked still, his body swaying as a red stain spread across the front of his shirt. He dropped to his knees, then collapsed sideways, his own gun slipping from his hand. Cain cursed, turning away to search for a new target amid the chaos tightening around him as Lucas's men finally broke through the defenses and poured inside. Lucas reached Teddy as the gunfire began to thin, kneeling beside the man who had betrayed him, and in his eyes was a nameless wreckage of fury, pain, and a shattered question. Teddy looked up at him, blood spilling from the corner of his mouth, and with his final broken breaths, he told him everything. He told him about Sloane, about the gambling debt Cain had bought, about the cruel choice between his sister and the man he had served with loyalty, about how he had tried to pass along the smallest pieces of information, had tried to delay, had prayed he could find a way out that had never existed. He said he wasn't asking to be forgiven, that he knew he didn't deserve it, that he only wanted Lucas to know he had never stopped seeing him as the only brother he had. Lucas tightened his grip around Teddy's cooling hand. The anger inside him, the thing that should have flared into hatred, instead dissolved before the sight of the man dying because he had just taken a bullet for the woman Lucas loved. He thought of himself, of the things a person would do when an enemy held the only thing they still had left to lose, and he understood, with a pain that cut deep, that Teddy had been placed in the very hell Lucas himself was living inside. Lucas bent closer and told his right-hand man that he forgave him, that Sloane would be safe, that he would take care of her the way Teddy had once taken care of this family, and that Teddy was not dying as a traitor, but as the man who had saved Quinn's life. Something like relief flickered across Teddy's ashen face, as though that was the only thing he had needed to hear before he could leave. He whispered a thank you too soft to be heard clearly, his eyes searching toward Quinn, who was crawling closer through tears, and he tried to lift a weak smile, as if to tell her she was safe now, that it was enough. Then his hand went slack in Lucas's grasp, his last breath, leaving him like a sigh that had finally laid down its burden, and Theodore Voss died in the cold warehouse, not as the pawn Victor Cain had used, but as a man who had reclaimed his soul in his final moment. Quinn held Bruno as the dog whimpered beside the body, her tears falling beyond her control, and Lucas remained kneeling, motionless, his hand still clasping the hand of the brother he had lost, allowing grief to touch him for the first time in 6 years, without turning it into ice. But inside that grief, a cold fury also rose, because not far away, Victor Cain was still there, and the final reckoning between two lifelong enemies had not yet been decided. The gunfight had died down, Cain's men either fallen or fleeing, and when the gun smoke settled, Victor Cain found himself driven into the far corner of the warehouse, his small empire for the night collapsing around him. Lucas walked toward him, each step slow, the gun hanging at his side, but his entire body was a sentence already passed. Cain was out of bullets, or nearly so, and for the first time in many years, The man who had spread terror across Ashford Bay tasted the flavor of fear. He backed away until his spine struck the wall. And then, like a cornered animal, he laughed, a mad laugh, and began tearing open the old wound again. He spoke of Adeline, of Ivy, of that night 6 years ago, describing it with poisonous words chosen to cut as deeply as possible into Lucas, savoring every tremor that passed across his enemy's face. He wanted Lucas to kill him in a frenzy of rage, because even in defeat, Victor Kane still wanted to steal the final thing, wanted to turn Lucas back into the monster he himself had created, wanted to prove that beneath that newly awakened surface, Lucas was still no different from him. Lucas raised the gun, pressed the barrel to Kane's forehead, and his finger tightened around the trigger. 6 years of hatred gathered into this one moment. 6 years of sleepless nights. 6 years of carrying the image of his wife's and child's bodies inside him. Every cell in him screamed for him to pull the trigger, to end it, to make a blood debt answerable only by blood. It was then that Quinn's voice rose behind him. Not a scream, but a plea hoarse with tears, calling his name. She stepped forward and stood beside him, not placing herself between him and Kane to protect him, because she had no mercy at all for the man who had murdered innocents and had just taken Teddy from them. She placed her hand on Lucas's trembling arm and told him that Kane wasn't worth losing himself over one more time. She said that if he pulled the trigger, he would give Kane exactly what he wanted, would let him drag Lucas back into the frozen grave he had only just escaped, and that she wasn't begging for Kane's life, she was begging for Lucas's soul, for the man her mother had saved, for the man she had seen kneel beside his dog and listen as she spoke of paper cranes. She told him Teddy had died so she could live, and if Lucas killed Kane in hatred, that death would only place one more body on his hands, not bring him the peace he had been longing for. Lucas stood motionless, the gun barrel still pressed to his enemy's forehead, and inside him raged the fiercest struggle of his life, between the monster tragedy had forged and the man love had just called awake. His breathing was heavy, his hand trembling, and then, slowly, he lowered the gun. Kane let out a sneering laugh and hissed that Lucas was a coward, that he didn't have the nerve, but Lucas only looked at him with eyes that were no longer ice cold, but filled with a quiet contempt, and said that giving him a bullet would be too merciful, that he would have to live a long time in a prison cell, stripped of power, stripped of his name, forgotten, and that was the hell he deserved. Just then, sirens wailed, and blue and red lights swept across the warehouse's broken windows. Sergeant Holloway, the honest police officer who had pursued both Kane and the Hale family for many years, walked in with her team. Lucas had called her on his way there, and with that call came the entire file, the evidence, the financial networks, and the crimes of Victor Kane that the Hale family had quietly gathered for 6 years. Holloway looked at Lucas for a long while, understanding that this man wasn't clean either, but tonight he had given her what she needed to end Victor Kane under the law. She cuffed Kane, who was still screaming curses, and led him outside, stripping him of the power and freedom he had used to destroy so many lives. Lucas turned to Quinn, let the gun fall to the floor, and for the first time in 6 years, he felt not the emptiness of revenge, but something close to peace, fragile yet real, beginning to glow inside his chest. In the back room, Holloway's team located a battered, semi-conscious Frank Doyle. He was hauled out in stretchers, alive but facing a long prison sentence alongside his new master for his role in the conspiracy. The weeks after that night in the Old Harbor District passed slowly, like a great wound learning how to heal. One evening, when Quinn came to Lucas's penthouse, he handed her the silver crane he had kept ever since the day it fell onto the street. He said it was time to return it to its owner, but there was something inside it he had never dared to open. The piece of paper folded into quarters that he had seen on that first night, but had not had the courage to read. Quinn sat down, opened the tiny clasp hidden in the crane's wing, and took out the paper that had yellowed with the years. It was her mother Marion's handwriting, a small note she had written and hidden inside the crane long ago, perhaps never imagining there would come a day when it would be read. Quinn read it aloud, her voice trembling in the quiet room. Her mother had written that she had spent her life beside people, standing on the line between life and death, and that she had learned one thing she wanted to pass on to her daughter, that no one was born evil, only wounded so deeply that they forgot they had once been kind, that kindness given to someone the whole world had rejected was the only thing powerful enough to pull them back into being human, and that every crane she folded was a reminder that even in the darkest night, one hand reaching out could still save a soul. When Quinn finished reading, they both fell silent, because neither of them needed to say aloud what the paper had already said for them. Marion had never known who the wounded young man she saved all those years ago would become, had never known that the crane she placed in his hand would one day come back to save her own son many years later, had never known that the words she wrote would close a circle she had unknowingly opened. But her lesson had become true inside this very room, where a man who had once been a monster was being pulled back into being human by the very kindness she had believed in. Lucas held the note in his hand, and for the first time since the day he buried his wife and child, he let his tears fall, not tears of hatred, but of something that had finally been loosened inside him. Wyatt recovered better than anyone had expected, the new kidney working steadily, and with each passing day, color returned to the face of the teenage boy who had once been as thin as a leaf. He didn't know everything that had happened on the night his sister had nearly lost her life, but he knew the man named Lucas had saved them both in more ways than he could count. As for Lucas, he didn't become a saint, and he didn't pretend that he could. He faced Sergeant Holloway not as a man running from the law, but as a man choosing to take responsibility for what he had done. He surrendered the parts of his empire he could surrender, cooperated with the investigation, and accepted that the road toward atonement would be long and would have its cost. Perhaps even years he would have to pay to the law. He began dismantling the darkest pieces of the family business, moving what could be moved into the light, and used his resources to make sure Sloane, Teddy's sister, had her debts paid off and was safe, keeping the promise he had made to the brother who had died in his arms. Renata watched the son she had raised walk the rough road of redemption, and in her eyes there was a deep comfort, because she knew a man who took responsibility for his sins was far closer to salvation than a man who pretended he was innocent. One afternoon, Quinn brought the silver crane to a jeweler and asked him to repair the tiny clasp that had loosened and reconnect the chain that had broken on that fateful day. When she put it back around her neck, she felt its familiar weight pressing against her chest. No longer only a keepsake from a mother who was gone, but now a witness to a truth her mother had written and left behind, that kindness, no matter how small, could travel farther than anyone dared imagine. Many months later, on a spring morning flooded with honey-gold sunlight pouring over the small garden behind the new house that Quinn and Wyatt now called home, a place far away from the dark streets and the exhausting night shifts of the past, Quinn stood in the sunshine, no longer the thin server who always lowered her head and turned herself into a shadow just to survive, no longer forced to run from anything or anyone. She stood straight, her face peaceful, the repaired silver crane shining at her collar, a silent witness to everything she had endured. Wyatt sat nearby beneath the shade of a tree, healthy and radiant in a way she hadn't dared dream of many months before, talking and laughing about his plans for the fall, about going back to school, about a future that not long ago had seemed closed forever. Bruno lay at Quinn's and Lucas's feet, his enormous head resting on his front paws, his brown eyes half closed in the sun. The creature once turned into a weapon of fear now returned to his true nature, a loyal guardian for the people he loved. Lucas stood beside Quinn, and the man once known throughout Ashford Bay as the Undertaker now carried himself differently, still quiet, still bearing scars that would never fade, but those winter eyes were no longer frozen shut. He was walking the long and uneven road of atonement, facing the cost of his old years with responsibility, not running from it, and that honesty was the very thing that made Quinn believe people truly could change. He looked at her in the early sunlight, and softly repeated the phrase he had used to belittle her on the first day. Little server. But this time, it carried an entirely different meaning, no longer the contempt of a boss toward a shadow, but the deepest gratitude of a man toward the girl who had taught him that a heart he believed dead could beat again, that the little server he had once meant to teach a lesson had turned out to be the one who saved him. Quinn smiled, raised her hand to touch the crane at her throat, and in that moment she felt her mother very near, the woman who had planted a seed of kindness many years earlier, without ever knowing what it would one day become. Their story closed not with a perfect miracle, but with a simple and profound truth, that every person deserves to be seen as a human being, that respect and kindness given to someone the world has rejected may be the only light strong enough to pull them out of the dark, and that no one, no matter how lost, is beyond returning. Dear viewers, if the story you have just heard has touched your heart, please press the like button, share this video with those you think need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing you many meaningful and compelling stories every day. We would truly love to know how you feel about this story, whether it has reminded you of something from your own life, of a time when someone treated you with kindness in your hardest moment, or a time when you yourself reached out to someone who seemed to have no one left beside them. Please leave a few lines in the comments so that we and everyone here can listen to the sincere feelings from deep within your heart. Because sometimes, one small kind word or one act of respect given to another person can change an entire life, just as a silver crane and a compassionate nurse did in today's story. Thank you for spending your time listening all the way to these final moments. We sincerely wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, peace of mind, and quiet happiness in each day that passes. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next stories.